Hi everyone, and welcome to the 1800RESPECT webinar series. Today's topic will be focusing on a whole-of-government response to violence in the home. 1800RESPECT is pleased to welcome your presenter, the Honourable Andrew McIntosh, Member for Kew in the Victorian State Parliament. Andrew McIntosh was the first Minister for Crime Prevention to be appointed in any state government in Australia. As Minister for Crime Prevention, Andrew was able to put the emphasis on a whole-of-government approach to funding initiatives to assist in preventing crime, including new measures to deal with family violence. Elected as Member for Kew in the Victorian State Parliament in June 1999, Andrew McIntosh was Minister for Corrections, Minister for Crime Prevention, and Minister for the establishment of an independent, broad-based anti-corruption commission in the coalition government between December 2010 and April 2013. This webinar is live and interactive. You are encouraged to participate by posing questions to the presenter. Please note that case-specific information cannot be answered during this webinar. All other questions can be typed into the chat box, which is located at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Responses to your questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. After the session, you will be redirected to an online survey, which can help us to improve the running of our future webinars for you. We have already incorporated some great ideas from your feedback, so thank you and keep them coming. We also encourage you to participate in the discussion tool, which you will be redirected to after completing the survey. We will be closing this thread at 2:15 p.m, so jump on if you have any further questions that we may not have time for during the next 45 minutes. I'd now like to pass you over to Andrew to begin his presentation.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you. I'll just start with perhaps just a little bit of background. I was first elected to Parliament in 1999, spent a considerable amount of time in opposition, and when the government of which I was a minister was finally elected, I was, of course, given a number of portfolios, but most importantly given the portfolio of crime prevention. Regrettably, after what could only be described as a minor transgression in an unrelated area to my portfolio responsibilities, the chairman of the Privileges Committee, I had to go and see the Premier and ultimately resigned all of my ministerial portfolios. I also start with a mea culpa in relation to the issue of violence against women and children, and that mea culpa is that I grew up in a household, a very happy household. I have no experience of even being hit or abused by my parents. And of course the issue of family violence is quite alien to me. Indeed, probably the principal driver of my career as both a politician and as a barrister before entering Parliament was my mother. And indeed my mum is still alive in her late 80s, but was a long-standing member of the Victorian Bar practising as a barrister, and I followed her into that career. Likewise, she was a very active member of the Liberal Party of which I'm a member, and I remember standing on polling booths at a very early age. I give that mea culpa because I spent a considerable amount of time in opposition as either a Shadow Attorney General or a Shadow Minister of Police and Emergency Services dealing with violence, particularly the issue of alcohol-fuelled violence. And indeed, when the monthly statistics would be published by Victoria Police, I would get on my little truck, beat my way to the media and start criticising the government by all of these appalling statistics. I've got to say, as I said, it was a complete revelation as a minister. Within about a month of my taking up my ministerial portfolio, we set up a number of regional reference groups in relation to crime prevention. And those regional reference groups started for me in Mildura. And we had members of local government, we had representatives of Victoria Police, a teacher from the local high school, and a number of other leaders in their communities. And indeed, the issue was put up to them as to what do they see as the most important issue facing their community in relation to criminal offending. And surprisingly, they to a person said the issue of family violence was the most important issue that they faced as a community. And I've got to say, with a degree of embarrassment, that was replicated all around the state in the 16 other regional reference groups we set up, both in metropolitan Melbourne and large regional centres. You know, and again, the community was speaking with one voice that this was the single biggest issue. I certainly came on board with no practical experience in the area, and indeed having been perhaps misdirected over a number of years in dealing with the issue of violence and only attributing to alcohol-fuelled violence. That was only one symptom of a much broader problem, and since that time I have attempted as a minister and indeed as a backbencher now to do something about that. Can I say that I speak now as an MP? I don't represent the Victorian government, although I have a very close working relationship with Minister Wardage, who is responsible for this area and is doing a magnificent job in relation to this. But certainly I was able to perhaps participate in my government, the Victorian government's change of heart, and indeed continue to do so. I saw as my first task was to oversee the business of locking up perpetrators who had been sentenced in prison as a Minister for Corrections, and also ultimately to find ways of preventing crime. But as I said, the most important thing is it wasn't just about alcohol-fuelled violence. It is probably a reflection of the current mentality of fighting this and that we're supposed to wage wars on things we don't necessarily want, of being reactive rather than proactive. And indeed, most importantly, that was certainly the way that I went into government, in serving the government and the community. But I was very pleased, as the first ever Minister for Crime Prevention in this country, to try and change the prospect or outlook of the government and the perception of the government into what I see is a far more fundamental and important issue. And my change really came about by the recognition of one important statistic. And that important statistic was the fact that 1 in 4 children in this country are subject and witness either as victims or witness violence in their own home. As I said, my home was a very happy home, and violence in the home was something completely alien to me. But the fact that 1 in 4 children in this country are exposed to family violence, I think is a disgrace and deserves a significant amount of attention by governments, not only here in Victoria, but around the country. And indeed, I'm very, very pleased that I was able to participate in our response to the national plan that was initiated by the former Labor government federally and continued by the current government. And indeed, when you look at it, it is a whole of government response that is required, but also it is something that should not be dependent upon whether a Liberal government or a Labor government or otherwise forms government in either the states or the Commonwealth. And I understand that some of you, those watching and listening to the webinar today, will have far more experience in dealing with family violence than myself. I'll be talking to you today about the challenges that government has in dealing with family violence, drawing upon my own experience and participation in that government's response. I will, in the main, be talking about what my own government has done, but Victoria should be seen as a microcosm and representative of the rest of Australia, because I know there is significant work being done elsewhere in Australia. Victoria's problems are Australian problems as well. In the main, and this is an important issue, in the main, ours is not a violent society. Our homicide rate is low, and certainly by other international standards, whether it's America or South Africa, our rate of crime is certainly much lower than theirs. However, on the surface of our suburbs, there is a significant issue that we face. In Melbourne and throughout Australia, the menace of violence lies under the often glossy exterior of attractive suburban houses and well cared for gardens. Family violence does not respect the niceties of class boundaries or occupation. One of the more notorious cases of which I became aware of course, occurred in the electorate that I was born, grew up in, and now have the honour to represent. the electorate of Kew. The man, James Ramlich, a well-connected and respected businessman, received only 11 years for his wife's slaying because he was acquitted of murder and convicted only of manslaughter due to the successful use of the defence of provocation. Provoked, apparently, because his wife told him that she was leaving him. Much was made of her being heartless in leaving her husband despite the evidence of years of being battered. As I said, he was convicted only of manslaughter. Others, such as Peter Keogh, received even lighter sentences in similar circumstances. Mr. Keogh's case received a lot of publicity because he was the sister of Phil Cleary, who is, of course, a well-known AFL commentator on the TV here in Victoria and indeed a former federal member of Parliament. As I said, the term family violence and domestic violence hardly seems sufficient to describe the reality of experienced violence at the hands of another family member, overwhelmingly the male partner in the home. There are male victims of family violence, but this is predominantly a gender-based crime where the physically strong intimidate and control the more vulnerable members as their right. What has to be appreciated is the magnitude of the problem of family violence. I confess that family violence did not have much as a meaning to me until I became a government minister. As I said, I grew up in a household, a very happy household, and indeed followed my mother, both politically and indeed as a member of the Victorian Bar. But I was quite shocked on becoming the Minister for Crime Prevention, and in addition, as I said, as a Minister for Crime Prevention, initiated a number of community consultations represented by members of the local community, such as local government, police and otherwise. And as I said, consistently, they confirmed to me that in their mind the issue of family violence was the most serious issue that each and every one of those communities face. The reporting of family violence has doubled in the last 10 years. In Victoria, a rise in the crime rate of 1.2% has just been reported. Crimes against the person, which include assault and robbery, have risen by 0.06% per 100,000 people. Yet car theft and house burglaries are down, as are assaults outside the home. The increasing levels of crime is being driven by family violence and drug offences, and indeed the willingness of people now to report the crime of family violence. Our Chief Commissioner here in Victoria, Ken Lay, said in announcing the crime figures that domestic violence accounts for most of the physical attacks or assaults being reported. Victoria Police report that 40% of crimes committed against the person are occurring in people's own homes. Chief Commissioner Lay warned last year that the family violence problem is far worse than police ever imagined. While women have become more willing to report violence, there are external factors which cause spikes in family violence, such as a deteriorating economic situation. That should not be used as an excuse by any stretch of the imagination. It is just a reality. I noted in just one country region, the Macedon Ranges, for example, that police statistics released last month show a spike or an increase in the rate of family violence of some nearly 23%. The police said financial difficulties along with drug and alcohol use were often circumstances surrounding particular households where family violence is present. Again, that should not be used as an excuse or in any way a defence. According to the Australian Bureau of Criminology, between 70 to 80 intimate partner killings occur each year in Australia. At least one woman is killed each week by a partner or ex-partner in Australia. And the children are not immune from attacks, as we saw with the tragic death of Luke Batty here in Victoria, undertaking the simple activity of going to a cricket training where his father, of course, set upon him and killed him. A tragic circumstance that indeed proves the case, regrettably. For me, the most telling fact is that children are increasingly witnessing violence in the home. 1 in 4 Australian children, as I've said, are being exposed to family violence. Victoria Police attended more than 18,000 family violence incidents where children were present in 2011-12, an increase of 26% from the previous financial year. It followed a 62% increase in violent incidents witnessed by children over the past 5 years. You can talk as much as you like about jails, but we have to look at the children because their education about violence begins in the home. Children can become traumatised by violent or intimidatory parents. They often don't learn well at school, they don't attend school in some circumstances, and they, regrettably, may model their behaviour, particularly if they are boys, on the abusive male parent, so beginning a new wave of violence in the community when they become adolescents or later adults. Community attitudes about violence against women have improved, but they are still disturbing. The National Survey on Community Attitudes to Violence Against Women found that 1 in 5 people believe family violence can be excused if people temporarily lose control and truly regret what they have done. 1 in 20 Australians believe women who are raped ask for it. 13% of women often say no when they mean yes, and women are particularly responsible if they are raped when drunk or drug affected. As I said, this is a community attitude. 1/5 of the community believe men and women are equally responsible for violence in the home. And 1/3 of Australians believe rape results from men being unable to control their need for sex. Although alcohol and drug use and financial difficulties may be a factor in family violence, they are not necessarily the triggers. All that is required to create a maelstrom of violence in the home is a keystone or guiding idea or belief or an idea that the men have the right to control women and children. Women may be bashed according to this mentality because they did not have tea on the table quickly enough or because they dared to disagree. And that women finally flee, they are in the greatest danger from such controlling men who kill without remorse. Family violence has always been a crime that is not quite as serious as other crime. It is believed that men were the masters of their own home and the home was their castle and the law should not intrude. But vestiges of the past remain, and such provision as partial defence of provocation, which I've already mentioned, are an example of that. And I'm very pleased that the government has now abolished the defence of provocation in Victoria in those circumstances. As shown recently on the SBS Insight program, which discussed the murder of an Iranian-Australian woman killed by her husband at a family celebration after she had separated from him. He had been violent towards his wife and children all their lives and saw this as a matter of honour. He was a pillar in his own community, and no one, as so often, knew that he had been violent in his own home. It is a story repeated again and again. A man who believes his manliness involves his having total control over his family. Given society's privileging of men's rights and the hidden nature of family violence for years, this has been swept under the carpet, and this should no longer be the case. The pattern of controlling behaviour and abuse has not changed. What is different is the way the government and police are now responding. Certainly, I have spoken to a number of police and former police, and they tell me that over their experiences, quite often domestic violence or family violence was considered something that you would turn the other cheek and tell them not to do it and move on to what they consider to be far more important issues. I've got to say that that has changed, and I'm very pleased that change has taken place. Former Police Commissioner here in Victoria, Christine Nixon, certainly drove a significant agenda in relation to Victoria Police, and indeed that has carried through to the current Chief Commissioner of Police. And police now understand their obligations to deal with family violence as a crime and not just as a domestic to turn the other cheek. The justice system no longer regards family violence as a private relationship matter or just a domestic. It is now a policing priority, as I said, and core business of our courts. It reflects the belief of the community that government has to respond to the prevalence of violence against women and children. As I said, my education as Crime Prevention Minister came in the form of realising that family violence or domestic violence is not just a women's issue, but it's a men's issue, it's my issue, it's your issue, and it's our issue as a country. This cordoning off of violence against women has also been reinforced by placing domestic violence in the area of government dealing with women's issues. With the creation of the position of Minister for Crime Prevention, family violence could be dealt with in a different way, placing it front and centre in prevention and as a legitimate part of the criminal matters. Bringing it into crime prevention also allowed my government to take a more holistic approach to family violence, to see it as part of a broader picture of our society, warts and all. I note that in 2009, the Australian, as well as the New South Wales Law Reform Commission, examined family violence law and the legal framework to improve the safety of victims of family violence across Australia. Their report contained 186 recommendations for change. One of the key results was an expanded definition of family violence in the Family Law Act. The Australian government accepted this definition, amending the Family Law Act in 2011. This means that family violence is a violent and threatening behaviour or any other form of behaviour that coerces or controls a family member or causes that family member to be fearful will be included in the definition of family violence. It may include, but not limited to, physical violence, sexual assault or other sexual abusive behaviour, economic abuse, emotional or psychological abuse, stalking, kidnapping or deprivation of liberty, damage to property, whether or not the victim owns that property, causing injury or death to an animal, irrespective of whether the animal is owned by the victim, and behaviour by persons, including violence that causes a child to be exposed to the effects of that type of behaviour. In 2010, the Australian government released its national plan to reduce violence against women and children. It set out a framework of action over 12 years. It is being implemented over 4 3-year plans. I've got to say that, as I said, after taking on the responsibility, shortly after taking on the responsibility of Minister for Crime Prevention, I had the great honour and privilege of meeting with members of the National Plan, particularly the Chair, Libby Lloyd, and had a lot of dealings with her. But most importantly, that provides a framework which the Victorian Government has responded along with other governments to do with this matter. The magnitude, if I can talk in pure economic terms, the cost of violence is reckoned, this is family violence, is reckoned to be something in the order of $13.6 billion each year and likely to rise to over $15 billion if extra steps are not taken. Family violence costs us all. It's not just about those who experience it. It costs the community an enormous amount in relation to court time, in relation to policing time, in relation to medical treatment, whether it's mental illness or otherwise. It costs us a lot of money, and it's certainly worth resourcing this particular matter. As I said, in relation to Victoria, we have released our response to that plan called Everyone Has a Responsibility to Act, and was launched in October 2012. We are committed, that is the Victorian Government, and indeed which I am now a member of that party, we are committed to preventing family violence, holding perpetrators accountable and working to ensure women and children become safe. In Victoria, we are trying to prevent violence against women and children through a 3-faceted approach: prevention, education, community engagement. On top of that, there's also early intervention and indeed a response to violence. It involves a more coordinated and integrated response by government to family violence. The Victorian Government has committed an additional $90 million in 2012-2013 to the Action Plan to prevent violence against women and children, including the funding of an expanded counselling service and legal and police reforms. But the most important thing, if I conclude on this, early intervention is very important, but it becomes all of our responsibility. Yes, police are involved. People in our departments, our government departments, in our hospitals are also involved, but all of us must be involved. We must change the fundamental attitude that this is not just a women's issue, this is a critical issue that we face in this community, and we must do about it. And even if we get down to the economics of it, if we can save $13 billion here in Victoria alone, then that must be a significant benefit to the broader community. I thank you very much for listening, and more than happy to take any of your questions.
Thank you, Andrew, for that great presentation. Now, we are just going to bring up a quick poll question for everybody online to answer. So, of the following options, what should be the top policy priorities for government? So that's popping up on your screens now. If everybody could please choose from those three options there. The first option being parole reform in relation to sexual offenders. The second option you can choose from is warrant reform in the area of domestic violence. And the third option you're able to choose from is whole of government approach to executing warrants and enforcing protection orders. So if everybody online could please pop your answers in that poll there. We'll just give it a few moments while everybody has a chance to answer that polling question. Okay, that's great. We have had quite a few responses there. We've had an overwhelming response. 84% have said whole of government approach to executing warrants and enforcing protection orders is the best option. Okay, so we're now going to open up for just a few questions for Andrew to answer. So if you would like to ask a question, please do so by typing your questions into the chat box at the bottom left of your screen. Now, we have had a few questions come through from everybody asking if this presentation will be recorded. It definitely will be, and it will be sent through to you in a follow-up email with the recording attached. Okay, Andrew, so we have had a few questions come through. One of the questions being, in the aftermath of the Luke Batty murder, steps have been taken to improve the processing of warrants. Can you talk a little bit about whether these will offer more protection to domestic violence survivors?
I think the critical thing here is a coordination between different government agencies. One of the major problems that I became aware of and still aware of is that people that are subject to different types of orders, whether they be parole orders or indeed apprehended family violence orders, sometimes the left hand is not talking to the right hand. And I think in the case of Luke Batty, it seems that there you had someone that was, the father was suffering from serious mental issues, and while that had been brought to the attention of the health authorities, the problem was that he still represented a clear danger to the community, and of course Victoria Police also may not have known precisely in those circumstances. Likewise, some of the parole reforms here in Victoria that, and this is just a bit of a slight issue, but getting back to the same issue about the left hand talking to the right hand, one of the major reforms that has taken place in relation to parole arose out of a horrific murder in Geelong, and someone that was released from prison and was given parole, he then breached that parole, came back to the parole board, but regrettably it appears the parole board was not given the complete information about his antecedent behaviour before he breached his parole, and may have led to him having that parole breached. But the parole was not breached, and of course he went out and committed a horrific murder. I think the most important thing about it is that many different government agencies are involved in a variety of different violent areas, but particularly in relation to violence against women and children, it is in paramount importance to drive a significant agenda about the left hand telling the right hand what is going on, and to have a free flow of information in that regard. Okay, can you talk us through some of the recent changes in parole policy direction? Well, the first major step, and while I was the Minister for Parole, or Corrections, which parole comes within, I wasn't the responsible minister at the time of these reforms, but essentially what it meant was that the first thing that could occur if there's an apprehended violence order, rather than being limited to 3 days, it was extended to a 5-day period, which would give the opportunity for police then to renew it, rather than sort of perhaps falling stale over a weekend where you may have some difficulty getting a magistrate or a county court judge. I think the most important is extending that apprehended violence order. Now, in relation to parole, the government made it perfectly clear that in the drafting of the amendment, parole was an obligation, not a right. And indeed, if an offender re-offended, or indeed there was an issue where that should be cancelled, effectively the onus is shifted to the parolee to show why they should be continuing on parole. And that's the major difference. There has been a significant change in the parole board, with a number of new community members coming on board to reflect the community's concerns in relation to these matters. And most importantly, parole has to be seen not as a right, but an obligation that you undertake to try and reform yourself under that parole. And indeed, the ability to revoke parole is a lot clearer, and indeed a lot easier to obtain by the parole board and by the community.
That's great. Thank you, Andrew. Now, just a reminder to everybody online, if you would like to ask a question, please do so by typing into the chat box down the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Just a reminder to anybody who has asked a question, if we aren't able to get to your questions today, we have had quite a few come through. They will be dealt with later, and we will also chat about those in the discussion tool at a later time. Another question that's come through from Stephen: why does there seem to be a one-size-fits-all approach to addressing this issue? Indigenous Australians seem to not have a voice in the development of programs and policies that address individual communities' issues around family violence.
I've got to say I disagree with respect to Stephen. I think the critical thing here is that the Koori community has been intimately involved in all of our developments in relation to preventing crime against women and children. I think it is fair to say that there appears to be a higher incidence of violence against women and children in certain communities, and they need to be perhaps being given particular attention to. But as a result of my discussions with broader communities, particularly, as I said initially, in Mildura, but elsewhere in Victoria, the Koori communities were represented at those stakeholder meetings. But most importantly, can I just say the government, in addition to whatever it's investing in family violence measures, has a specific program to support Koori communities around Victoria. And indeed, as I said, in many cases, the Koori communities in some places do have a significant problem with family violence, but certainly that has been working through by a coordinated approach by government. And indeed, as I said, the Family and Community Violence Prevention Project, of course, is now being operated in Mildura, Robinvale and Swan Hill as a direct consequence of that consultation with local Kooris.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. We have had another question come through from Janine. Would government consider the introduction of a crime prevention authority that could provide resourcing to provide individualised funding for those at risk, early intervention in the way that VOCAT provides funding post-crisis?
Can I just say, primarily, the issue of family violence is primarily located in the portfolio of community services, and Mary Waldrich is the minister. But I think what is critical and what has occurred in the last few years is a recognition that it's not just the responsibility of one, siloed portfolio responsibility. And indeed, I have attended as a minister, when I was a minister, attended a number of meetings involving Mary and her department and otherwise, and indeed I had the opportunity of attending a huge seminar that was chaired by Mary, where some 50 people, some 7 ministers from different portfolios, from Police and Emergency Services, Crime Prevention, Attorney General, Women's Affairs, right through, all attended this with a large number of bureaucrats to develop a much more holistic, perhaps whole of government response to this issue. I can assure you from what I know, the government is working in a coordinated way with Victoria Police, with the welfare agencies, to get a much more coordinated response to the issue of family violence.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. We've got one more question here from Janelle. What are going to be some of the significant changes or supports for early intervention?
Well, certainly the issue of, in many cases, the opportunity of removing the male from the relationship, so issues about housing and indeed driving an agenda to provide emergency accommodation for women to get them away from the violent perpetrator. Of course, then there has to be a criminal justice response. Now that criminal justice response may depend upon the physical condition. If there's a mental illness or otherwise, then that should be dealt with as well. I understand that later today the Minister Waldrich will be announcing a significant reform in relation to the mental health system that will try and provide a much more therapeutic approach to support people that are being diagnosed with a mental illness, and rather than just removing the problem immediately, but to at least treat that problem if there is an element of mental illness. But as I said, it has to be a whole of government holistic response, and as I said, it is a significant problem that the government is dealing with.
Okay, and we have had one more question come through from Sonia. The question is, alcohol does not cause violence, but the police data shows it's involved in a considerable proportion of family violence, and research shows women are more severely injured when alcohol is involved. Does your whole of government response have a coordinated policy to respond to alcohol misuse and violence against women?
Yeah, I don't know if it's my response. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Victorian Government, I'm only talking from my experience. And as I said, one of the problems that I faced as a shadow minister before we elected the government was that the major issue that I dealt with was the issue of alcohol-fuelled violence. In opposition, of course, you're critical of the government about what they were doing, and there were a number of reforms in relation to that matter. Regrettably, of course, alcohol is a legal drug, and when taken in excess can be a significant driver of violence in our community, and particularly in our own home. All I can say is that a whole of government response, it's not just about locking the perpetrator up, it's not just about removing the woman from the particular environment, it's to try and develop a much more holistic response to particular circumstances. It is no longer a one-size-fits-all. It has to be tailor-made for the individual. Of course, it's very resource-intensive, but it's such a critical problem. We have to develop that. And one of the things that we were going through is this process of developing a whole of government response to these sorts of issues. So where alcohol is involved, then necessary steps can be taken, including perhaps potentially going to court to get a bond that would prevent somebody from taking or consuming alcohol at any particular stage, whether it's in the home or at all, of course, which means a breach of that, it becomes then a serious criminal offence and that person can be taken to jail. The critical thing here is that it's a whole of government response, and I think the major improvement that's occurred over the last few years is the fact that it's not just about police working in isolation. It's not just people in community services working in isolation. It's not just the courts working in isolation. What has been driven by this government is to try and develop a much more whole-of-government response where all agencies certainly work together. And certainly, from my experience, that's what's occurring. There's always room for improvement, and certainly in the issue of mental health, treatment of mental health, that's a significant problem that we have to deal with, but a whole-of-government response is the way to go, and that's the way of dealing with the issue of alcohol.
Okay, great. And another question's come through from Liz. Will there be an expanding of the men's behaviour change programs in the next Victorian Action Plan?
Well, I'm very pleased that you've asked that question, Liz, because the government, of course, has a priority of dealing with perpetrators as well as the victims, and particularly perpetrators with mental illness. And the government is apparently announcing today, I've been informed by Minister Waldridge, a new raft of men's behaviour programs in relation to the issue of mental illness. And the government's very supportive of these therapeutic programs, which enable groups to work together and through their particular issues, including mental health issues. And as we said, particularly they are related to men, and it has been a significant, perhaps, hole in the delivery of an outcome, and certainly this announcement by Minister Waldridge today significantly improved those matters. But of course, men can work together, and indeed men's behavioural change is not just related to mental illness, it can be alcohol abuse or indeed just a violent behaviour. But the most important is to intercept this, and if there is an offence, it can go through the criminal justice system, and indeed with the therapeutic courts, particularly dealing with family violence, and particularly the magistrates concentrating on that, there can be individual programs or action plans developed for men with the obligation to adhere to that program. Any breach of that program, of course, can lead to them going back to jail or back into the criminal justice system to be dealt with.
That's great. Thank you, Andrew. I'm just scrolling through all of the questions in the chat box. We have had quite a number of questions come through today. So a reminder to everybody, if your question has not been answered, please fill out the survey and you will be redirected through to the discussion tool, and Andrew will be able to answer some more questions there. Now that does look like we are out of time for today. So thank you, Andrew, for answering all of those questions, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Please stay logged in to take our short online survey, and at the end of the survey you'll be provided with a link to our discussion forum where you can discuss any comments or ask any further questions you may have for Andrew. Now, we do thank you in advance for your feedback. Every comment you make is taken into serious consideration. Now, I'd just like to take a moment just to mention our next webinar in the series. This one is on exploring practical ways of helping women and children who have experienced domestic and family violence to stay safely in their home. The webinar will be presented by Dr. Angela Spinney, who is an experienced academic on homelessness and its prevention and the housing consequences of domestic and family violence. And this webinar will take place on Thursday, the 10th of April. Lastly, you can find all of the webinar presentations online in the 1800RESPECT site, and you can also subscribe to the YouTube channel. So on behalf of the 1800RESPECT team, I thank you all for attending this webinar and hope that you have found it valuable. Please stay online now to take our quick survey. Thank you, and until next time.